The Hells Angels biker watched the little girl uncover a hidden tunnel, and what lurked there should have stayed buried. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's gripping story. It was a cold and dark evening when the rumble of a Harley-Davidson cut through the silence of the forest. Jake Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, was cruising down a narrow, winding road, his mind far away from the ordinary concerns of life. He had been riding for hours, the wind and the engine's roar drowning out everything else. He loved these moments of solitude. But tonight, the night felt different. The storm clouds had gathered unexpectedly, casting an eerie shadow over the path. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye, a faint glow up ahead. It wasn't much, just a flicker in the distance, but it was enough to grab his attention. He slowed down, the grip of the cold air tightening as he neared. As he came closer, the source of the light became clear. A small figure stood at the edge of the forest, seemingly illuminated by the glow of something hidden. A little girl, no older than 10, her face a picture of concentration as she knelt beside a large rock. The unusual sight made Jake's heart race. His instincts were on alert. Bikers like him didn't often stop for anything or anyone, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But something about the girl made him pause. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence that followed was almost deafening. His boots crunched on the snow-covered ground as he approached, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. The girl, oblivious to his presence, continued to push aside rocks, her small hands working with surprising determination. "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here?" Jake's voice was low, rough from years of shouting over roaring engines. The girl froze, her small body tensing as she looked up at him. Fear flashed in her eyes, but only for a second before curiosity took over. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. "I found something," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jake's brow furrowed as he looked at the ground where she had been working. Sure enough, the earth had been disturbed, a small hole barely visible in the dim light. His heart skipped a beat. The girl's innocent words sparked something deep inside him. "What did you find?" he asked, moving closer, despite every instinct telling him to stay back. She hesitated for a moment before crouching down again. With one final shove, she moved the last of the stones, revealing a narrow tunnel entrance, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. The sight made Jake's skin crawl. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a place for a little girl to be digging around in. And yet, there she was, uncovering whatever lay beneath. His mind raced. What could possibly be buried in the cold, forgotten ground of these woods? Without thinking, he knelt beside her, his large frame looming over her small form. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The girl ignored him, her eyes wide with excitement as she began to inch closer to the entrance. "It's a secret tunnel," she whispered. "I think it leads to something big." Jake's gut tightened. A secret tunnel? What the hell was she talking about? There was no way in hell that any good could come from whatever lay hidden in this dark, cold forest. But the girl's curiosity was unrelenting, and for some reason, Jake couldn't bring himself to stop her. He had a bad feeling about this. A really bad feeling. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the little girl continued to dig around the narrow entrance of the tunnel. Despite his better judgment, he found himself mesmerized by her curiosity. The cold air around them seemed to grow heavier as the girl inched closer to the dark, eerie opening in the ground. Jake glanced around nervously. The storm had picked up, and the wind howled through the trees, making the entire forest feel alive in a way that set his instincts on edge. He should have left. He should have told the girl to get away from whatever secret this tunnel held. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to move. As the girl pushed another rock aside, the tunnel widened just enough for her to slip inside. Her small frame squeezed through, and she disappeared into the darkness. "Wait!" Jake shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Get out of there!" But it was too late. She was already gone. Without thinking, Jake followed her, his heart racing. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back before things got worse. But something about the situation, something about the girl's innocent determination, kept him moving forward. He crouched down, gripping the edges of the tunnel, and pulled himself into the narrow passageway. The air inside was damp and thick with the smell of old earth. It was as if the tunnel had been buried here for centuries, forgotten by time. As Jake crawled forward, the darkness seemed to close in around him. He tried to focus on the sound of the girl's footsteps ahead, but they were barely audible. The tunnel twisted and turned, its path uncertain. Jake's breath quickened, and his muscles ached from the tight crawl. He should have been scared. Hell, he was scared. But there was something oddly comforting about being trapped in the tunnel, with only the girl's voice guiding him. After what felt like an eternity, Jake finally saw a faint light ahead. He pushed forward, his body screaming for a break, but he couldn't stop now. The girl's voice, low and excited, echoed through the tunnel. "I found it," she whispered. "I found something inside." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dust in the air. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she crawled farther ahead, her small hands reaching for something in the darkness. Jake's anxiety spiked. What was she doing? What could be so important inside this tunnel? He crawled faster, desperate to catch up. As he rounded a bend, he saw her, standing in front of an old wooden door. It looked out of place in the tunnel, as if it had been built for something or someone else. The girl stared at it in awe. Her fingers hovered just inches from the doorknob. "I think this is it," she murmured. The treasure. Jake's stomach twisted. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. The door was too old, too strange. And yet, the girl seemed so sure, so innocent. Like she had just stumbled upon a forgotten piece of history. He reached out to stop her. "We need to go back, kid," he said, his voice firm. "This is not the place for you." But she didn't listen. She turned the knob, and the door creaked open with a groan that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Inside, the room was dimly lit by what appeared to be old lanterns, flickering with a cold, ghostly light. Jake's eyes scanned the room, taking in the strange symbols on the walls and the piles of old, dusty artifacts scattered across the floor. But what caught his attention wasn't the room. It was what lay in the center. There, sitting atop a pedestal, was a small wooden chest. It was intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift when he looked at them, like the chest was alive in some way. The girl's eyes went wide. "This is it," she breathed. "This is the treasure." But Jake didn't feel excitement. He felt dread. He had seen enough in his time with the Hell's Angels to know that some things were best left untouched, best left buried. But the girl reached forward, her small hands trembling as she lifted the chest from its pedestal. As soon as her fingers made contact with it, a low rumble filled the air, like the ground itself was waking up. The walls shook, and dust fell from the ceiling. Jake's heart raced as he grabbed the girl's arm and yanked her back. "Get away from it," he shouted. But it was too late. The room seemed to come alive, shifting, expanding, as if the tunnel itself was reacting to the chest. The girl screamed, and Jake pulled her back towards the tunnel, but the entrance had already begun to collapse. Rocks and debris fell from above, blocking their way out. They were trapped. Jake's mind raced as he looked around the room, searching for another way out. But there was none. The chest, now glowing with an otherworldly light, seemed to be the source of the disturbance. And as Jake watched, he realized that whatever lay inside wasn't a treasure, it was a curse. Jake's heart raced as the room trembled around him. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force, as if the entire tunnel was alive. The chest that the little girl had pulled from its pedestal continued to glow, its eerie light casting strange shadows across the dark room. The ground beneath them cracked and shifted as rocks and debris began to fall from above, trapping them inside. "What the hell is going on?" Jake muttered under his breath, his mind racing. His instincts told him to get the girl out of there, but the tunnel was already collapsing, blocking their only escape route. Panic began to seep into his thoughts. He had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so cursed. The little girl, who had been silent since the chest had been opened, stood frozen in front of it, her small hands still trembling from the encounter. "We need to get out of here now," Jake shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back towards the tunnel entrance. But the rocks continued to fall, sealing off their escape. With every passing second, The rumbling grew louder, and the chest's glow intensified, casting a sickly light that made Jake's skin crawl. It was clear that whatever force had been unleashed by the opening of the chest was far beyond their control. The girl, her face pale and wide-eyed, struggled against Jake's grip. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "What did we wake up?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy scanning the room for another way out. But there was none. The walls were closing in, and the ground beneath them was crumbling. The tunnel had turned into a death trap, and they were stuck. His fingers tightened around the girl's arm as he pulled her further away from the glowing chest, instinctively trying to shield her from whatever horrors it contained. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice sharp. But the girl's eyes remained fixed on the chest, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "I don't understand," she muttered, almost to herself. "It's supposed to be treasure." Jake cursed under his breath. "This isn't treasure, kid," he said, his voice low with urgency. "This is a damn curse, and we need to get out of here before it's too late." As they backed away, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The tunnel was collapsing around them, and the only thing Jake could think of was getting the girl to safety. But the chest's glow was impossible to ignore. It pulsed with a dark energy, as if it was calling them, beckoning them to come closer. The girl, despite her fear, seemed drawn to it. She took a small step forward, her hand reaching out toward the chest, as if in a trance. "No!" Jake shouted, grabbing her by the wrist and yanking her back. "I said stay away from it." The girl pulled against his grip, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and wonder. "But it's just a chest," she whispered. "What's inside? Why does it feel so important?" Jake's pulse quickened. He knew the answer, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had seen things like this before, objects that carried ancient, malevolent power, things that were meant to stay buried. But the girl's innocent curiosity had opened the door to something far darker than either of them could understand. "It's not just a chest," Jake said, his voice tight. "It's something much worse. And we need to leave, right now." But before he could pull her any further, the tunnel's shaking intensified. The walls groaned under the pressure, and the air grew thick with dust and debris. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and the floor collapsed, sending Jake and the girl tumbling into a deeper, darker section of the tunnel. Jake's head slammed against the stone, and everything went black for a moment. When he came to, he found himself in a cavernous chamber, the dim light of the chest still glowing in the distance. The girl was beside him, dazed but unharmed. "Kid," Jake groaned, pushing himself up. "You okay?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. But as she stood, her gaze shifted to the glowing chest once more. And this time, she didn't seem afraid. She seemed mesmerized. "There's something inside," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I can feel it. It's calling me." Jake's stomach twisted. This was worse than he thought. This wasn't just some hidden treasure. This was something far more dangerous, and they had just unleashed it. Without another word, he grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her away from the chest. "We're getting out of here," he said firmly, "and we're not looking back." But as they turned to leave, a voice echoed through the cavern, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here," it rumbled. Jake froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in his mind. "It's too late now. The curse has been awakened." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the echoing voice filled the cavern. He spun around, his grip tightening on the little girl's hand, but all he could see was the same eerie glow from the chest ahead. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse, as if the very stones were alive, reacting to the unseen force that had just been unleashed. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice low and rough, yet filled with a sense of urgency. The girl beside him trembled, her wide eyes darting around the darkened room. She seemed almost entranced by the chest, as if the voice had reached deep into her, pulling her towards it. "I don't know," she whispered, barely audible, her voice full of awe. "But I can feel it. It's like it wants us to stay." Jake's gut twisted. He had dealt with enough dangerous situations in his life to know that this wasn't a normal occurrence. Whatever lay in that chest wasn't meant to be uncovered, and now they had both made the mistake of awakening it. "We can't stay here," Jake muttered, pulling the girl closer to him. "We need to leave. Now." But as he turned to find an exit, the cavern around them seemed to shift, the walls closing in tighter. A low rumble reverberated through the floor, the sound almost like a growl from the depths of the earth. The chest's glow grew brighter, casting long shadows across the room, and Jake felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. Whatever was inside that chest wasn't just a curse, it was something ancient, something powerful, and it wasn't going to let them leave so easily. "We're trapped," Jake said, his voice tight with realization. The girl, her hand still gripping his, looked up at him, fear now etched in her features. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake's mind raced. He had to think fast. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. This was beyond anything he had encountered. The chest in front of them was a gateway. He could feel it in his bones. And something told him that whatever came through it, whatever was hidden inside, had the power to destroy everything they knew. He looked around the cavern, searching for any way out. The air was thick with tension, and the walls, now alive with some sort of ancient energy, seemed to be closing in. He could see nothing. No doors, no escape route. Just the glowing chest. But then, just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye, an opening high above, barely visible in the flickering light. It was small, but it was there. Without thinking, Jake pulled the girl towards the wall, his mind focused on that tiny gap in the stone. He pushed against the rough surface, testing its stability, and then, without a moment's hesitation, began to climb. The girl hesitated at first, fear evident in her eyes. But she trusted him, and without question, she followed. They scrambled up the jagged rocks, their hands raw from the sharp edges, their breath quickening with every move. The chest's glow grew even stronger behind them, and Jake could feel the heat of it on his back. The cavern seemed to grow hotter, the air thicker, as if the chest was drawing them in. But they kept moving, higher and higher, toward the small opening. When Jake finally reached the top, he looked down at the girl, his hands trembling from the effort. "Come on," he urged, his voice filled with both determination and fear. She reached out, her small hands grasping his, and with one final heave, she was by his side. Together, they squeezed through the narrow opening, the weight of the energy in the cavern pulling at them, trying to drag them back. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. As they emerged into the narrow passage beyond, Jake breathed a sigh of relief. The glow from the chest was now just a faint light behind them, and the air felt cooler, less oppressive. They were free, or so they thought. The passage they found themselves in was dark and damp, the walls slick with moisture. But it wasn't empty. Jake's eyes scanned the space, his senses on high alert. Something wasn't right. The girl, her breath still shaky, looked up at him. "What is this place?" she whispered. Jake shook his head, his heart still racing from the near escape. "I don't know," he said, "but we're not out of danger yet." The passage stretched ahead of them, dark and foreboding, and Jake could feel the weight of something lurking in the shadows. Whatever had been in that chest, whatever power had been unleashed, it wasn't finished yet, and it wouldn't let them go that easily. The air grew colder, and Jake could hear something moving just beyond their sight. "Stay close," Jake said, pulling the girl to his side. "And don't look back." They walked forward, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the cold, narrow corridor. But with every step, the feeling of something watching them grew stronger. It was as if the very walls were alive, sensing their presence, waiting for them to make a mistake. Jake's mind raced, but there was no clear answer. He had no idea where this tunnel would lead, or what would be waiting for them at the end. But one thing was certain, the chest was just the beginning. Jake and the little girl moved cautiously through the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing softly in the damp, cold air. The oppressive atmosphere around them seemed to grow thicker with every step, as if the tunnel itself was closing in. The girl, her face pale and tense, clutched Jake's hand tightly, her fingers trembling. She didn't speak, but her wide eyes were full of fear and curiosity, both drawn to the unknown path ahead and terrified of what they might encounter. Jake, on the other hand, was a man used to danger, yet even he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in his gut. Whatever they had uncovered in that chest, it wasn't something that should have been disturbed. As they moved deeper into the passage, the sound of their footsteps was joined by something else, faint, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper in the darkness. Jake stopped, listening. The sound grew louder, more distinct. A soft, dragging noise. His pulse quickened. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded, her eyes darting around the dark tunnel, trying to locate the source of the sound. The whispering continued, a low hum that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that didn't belong here. "Stay close," Jake murmured, tightening his grip on her hand. His mind raced, piecing together the events that had led them here. That chest, the voice in the cavern, the way the tunnel had shifted and reacted to their presence. Everything was connected. But what was this force, this energy that had been unleashed? He had to figure it out, and fast. The noise intensified as they pressed forward, the shadows around them seeming to stretch and twist unnaturally. The tunnel narrowed, and the walls began to feel claustrophobic, pressing in from all sides. Jake could hear his breathing growing shallow, and he forced himself to calm down. The girl's footsteps faltered as she looked up at him, her face full of fear. "What is it?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer right away. He couldn't bring himself to lie to her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But whatever it is, it's following us." The girl clung to his side, her grip tightening, and Jake could feel the weight of her fear pressing on him. They continued moving, the sound of dragging growing louder, more erratic. Then, without warning, the tunnel opened up into a massive chamber, its ceiling so high it was lost in the darkness above. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that Jake had never seen before, etched deep into the stone as if they had been there for centuries. The air in the room felt alive, charged with an electric energy that sent a chill down his spine. And there, in the center of the room, was a figure. At first, it was a shadow, barely visible in the dim light, but as Jake's eyes adjusted, he saw it clearly, a massive, hulking figure, standing motionless. Its body was cloaked in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. The figure didn't move, but Jake could feel its presence, its eyes, if it even had eyes, watching them. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one arm slowly, pointing toward the far wall of the chamber. Jake followed its gesture and saw, in the faint light, a large stone door, ancient and weathered. It seemed to have been untouched for centuries. The figure's gesture was almost like an invitation, but Jake knew better than to trust it. He turned to the girl. "We need to leave," he said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. But the girl was staring at the door, her eyes wide with fascination. "I think we have to go there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's calling us." Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The girl was right. It was calling them. Somehow, he could feel it too. The door was like a magnet, pulling them in, drawing them closer to whatever was waiting on the other side. But Jake knew that whatever was behind that door was far worse than anything he had ever encountered. His heart raced as the whispering sound grew louder, now unmistakable. The chamber around them seemed to pulse, as if it was alive, reacting to the presence of the figure and the energy that had been released. "No," Jake said, shaking his head, his voice firm. "We're not going in there. We're getting out now." But as he turned to leave, the figure in the center of the room began to move. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, the robes falling away to reveal a tall, skeletal form, its skin mottled and decayed. Its face, hidden beneath the hood, was an impossible mask of darkness, empty and void of all features. It took one slow step toward them, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. Jake backed up, pulling the girl with him. "Run," he shouted. But it was too late. The figure's arm shot out, and a blast of cold air hit them both, freezing them in place. Jake tried to fight it, but the force was overwhelming. The air around them was thick with darkness, and the whispering sound grew louder, drowning out everything else. And then, as if summoned by the figure, the stone door began to open, revealing a swirling, inky darkness beyond. Jake's heart sank as he realized that whatever was waiting on the other side was far worse than he could have ever imagined. The girl, still frozen in place, looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The figure stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching toward them, and in that moment, Jake knew they were in more danger than they had ever been before. Jake could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around him as the skeletal figure stepped forward, its hand reaching toward them. He tried to pull the girl away, but the invisible force holding them, both in place, was too strong. The air around them felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere of the chamber was alive, pressing in on them from all sides. Jake's heart raced, his mind working furiously, but every instinct told him they were running out of time. He needed to act fast. "Stay close," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl, still frozen in fear, clung to his side, her breath shallow. She was terrified, and Jake couldn't blame her. They were up against something ancient, something beyond their understanding. The figure continued to move toward them, its steps slow and deliberate. With every step it took, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. Jake's pulse quickened as the creature's skeletal fingers reached for the girl. She gasped, but before Jake could react, a surge of energy shot through the air, knocking him backward. The force of the blast sent him crashing into the wall, the impact stunning him. He struggled to get back on his feet, his head spinning. The girl, now separated from him, screamed in terror. Jake's vision blurred as he tried to regain his bearings. His head ached, and his body felt heavy, but he had no time to waste. He had to protect her. The figure towered over the girl now, its dark presence overwhelming. It moved with an unnatural grace, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules as anything else in the world. The chest's glow had become blinding, casting an eerie light across the room. Jake could see the fear in the girl's eyes, and it made his heart ache. He couldn't let this thing take her. He couldn't get away from her. Jake roared, his voice filled with raw fury. He lunged forward, pushing through the strange force that seemed to hold him back. His muscles burned, his body screamed in protest, but he kept moving. The figure's gaze turned toward him, its hollow eyes void of all emotion. It didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Instead, it raised its other hand, and with a wave, the darkness around them deepened, enveloping the entire room in a black mist. The air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Jake's throat tightened, his vision narrowing as the darkness seemed to close in on him. He reached out for the girl, but the distance between them felt like miles. The creature began to speak, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through Jake's bones. "You should not have come here," it hissed. "Now you are part of the curse." The words sent a chill through Jake's body. A curse? What the hell was this thing talking about? Jake tried to focus, tried to think of a way out of this nightmare, but his mind was racing. Every part of him screamed to protect the girl, but he didn't know how to fight something like this. The creature's form began to change, its skeletal body shifting and warping in the darkness. It grew larger, more monstrous, its body stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. Jake could feel the ground beneath him vibrating, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close in even more, as if the entire structure was being pulled apart. The girl, still trapped by the creature's grip, looked up at Jake, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound of her voice broke through Jake's panic. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't let this thing take her. Jake gritted his teeth, his mind clearing for just a moment. He couldn't think, couldn't plan. But he knew one thing. He had to act. He reached down into the depths of his memories, searching for anything that might help. His training, his experiences with the Hell's Angels, the countless battles he had fought, they all came rushing back to him. But this was different. This wasn't a fight he was prepared for. The creature moved closer, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Jake could hear its breath, cold and rancid, like death itself. The girl screamed again, her voice filled with terror. That was enough. Jake's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he rushed forward, his fists clenched, ready to strike. The darkness surrounding them seemed to fight back, but Jake pushed through, his body surging with adrenaline. He reached the girl, grabbing her by the waist and yanking her away from the creature's grasp. The figure let out an inhuman scream, its form writhing in fury. Jake didn't hesitate. He pulled the girl toward the tunnel, toward the only chance they had left to escape. But just as they reached the opening, the walls of the chamber cracked, sending a deafening crash through the tunnel collapsed in front of them, blocking their path. Jake stumbled, pulling the girl back as the stone fell around them. "We're trapped," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The girl clung to him, her small body shaking with fear. Jake looked around, his mind racing. They had no way out. The only option was to face the creature. But he wasn't about to give up. He wasn't about to let it take them. "Stay close," Jake ordered, his voice hard with determination. "We fight." Jake's muscles tensed as the walls of the chamber groaned under the pressure, sending tremors through the floor. The creature's monstrous form towered before them, its skeletal body shifting and twisting, as if it were made of shadows. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had faced dangerous men, dangerous situations, but this was something far beyond anything he had ever encountered. The girl clung to his side, her eyes wide with fear as she trembled next to him. She had no idea what they were up against, but Jake could feel the danger radiating off the creature. There was no escape. They were cornered, and the only way out was through this thing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady his breath. He needed a plan. He had to protect the girl. She was counting on him. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded, her small body shaking, but she didn't move. She trusted him, and that made everything even harder. He couldn't let her down. The creature's hollow eyes locked onto them, its mouth stretching open to reveal sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the faint light. Its voice, low and rasping, echoed through the cavern. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You are bound to the curse now. Forever." Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew there was no easy way out. The only chance they had was to fight with everything they had. He wasn't going to let this thing drag them down. With a swift movement, Jake lunged forward, aiming a punch at the creature's chest. But his fist passed right through it, as if the creature was made of smoke. The force of his punch sent a shock wave through the air, the cavern trembling as the creature's form rippled. The girl gasped, her fear escalating. "Jake, it's not real," she cried. Jake's eyes widened as he realized the truth. This creature, this monster, wasn't made of flesh and blood. It was a manifestation of something much darker, a force that existed beyond the physical realm. "We can't fight it like this," Jake muttered to himself, his mind racing for a solution. The creature's laughter echoed through the chamber, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "You cannot defeat me," it taunted. "You are trapped in my world now." Jake's pulse quickened. This was no longer about physical strength. It was about survival. They needed to find a way to break free from whatever curse had bound them to this place. He turned to the girl, her face pale with terror. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice urgent. "We have to stay focused. We can't let it control us." The girl nodded, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Jake could see the fear in her, and he knew she was scared. He was scared too, but they had to keep moving, keep fighting. "We need to break the connection," Jake said, his voice firm with newfound resolve. "The creature's power comes from the chest. It has to." Without thinking, Jake turned and bolted toward the glowing chest, the only thing in the room that seemed to be the source of the creature's power. The girl followed, her small feet stumbling behind him, but she didn't stop. They had to do this. They had to stop whatever force had been unleashed. The creature hissed in fury, its voice growing louder as it pursued them, but Jake didn't look back. He couldn't. He could feel the heat of the creature's rage behind him, its presence a constant threat, but he forced himself to focus on the chest. He had no idea what would happen once they reached it, but he had to try. As they approached, Jake felt the temperature in the room rise, the air thick with tension. The chest pulsed with a dark energy, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter with every step they took. The creature's voice filled their ears, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. "You cannot escape," it repeated, its words now laced with malice. Jake gritted his teeth, his hand reaching out for the chest. His fingers brushed against its surface, and an electric shock shot through his body, forcing him to pull back. The chest's glow intensified, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something shift within it. Something moving, something alive. The girl, standing beside him, looked at the chest with wide eyes. "What's inside?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer. He didn't know, but he knew they had to stop it. With a deep breath, he reached for the chest again, his fingers now gripping it tightly. As soon as he made contact, a powerful force shot through him, a wave of energy that knocked him backward, sending him crashing to the floor. The girl screamed, her voice filled with panic, but Jake couldn't move. His body was paralyzed by the overwhelming power that had surged through him. The walls of the cavern trembled, and the chest's glow grew blinding. The room now filled with a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light faded, and the air grew still. Jake struggled to sit up, his head spinning. The girl was kneeling beside him, her hands shaking as she helped him to his feet. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Jake didn't have an answer. He didn't know what had just occurred. But he could feel the power that had been holding them here was gone. And for the first time since they had entered the tunnel, he felt a glimmer of hope. The creature was silent now, its presence fading. Jake looked around, but the cavern was empty. The darkness seemed to recede, leaving only the faint glow of the chest behind. They were free. For now. But Jake knew this wasn't over. They had broken free from the creature's grasp, but whatever force had brought them here was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next move. And Jake was certain that their journey had only just begun. Jake stumbled to his feet, his body aching from the blast of energy that had surged through him when he touched the chest. The cavern, once filled with oppressive energy, now felt eerily silent. The girl stood beside him, her wide eyes scanning the room, her small body still trembling from the chaos they had just experienced. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "What just happened?" Jake shook his head, still trying to clear the fog in his mind. "I don't know," he muttered. But one thing was certain, they were no longer trapped. The creature, the dark force that had haunted them, was gone, and the tunnel seemed to have quieted. The chest's glow had faded, leaving only a dull shimmer that barely lit the space around them. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the cavern. The walls, once trembling with power, now stood still, almost as if the cavern itself had exhaled in relief. He didn't trust it. Nothing about this place felt safe. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice firm, his instincts telling him to move quickly. The girl, still shaken but trusting him, nodded. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Jake looked at the narrow passage that had brought them into the chamber. The only way out was through the winding tunnel they had crawled through, but he knew they couldn't go back the way they came. It felt like the entire place was still watching them, like the very stone around them was waiting for something. "We'll find another way," Jake said, glancing around the cavern. There had to be an exit. It wasn't just some dead end. This place wasn't meant to keep them here forever. As he turned to lead the way, something caught his eye, a faint crack in the wall, a faint light seeping through. His heart skipped a beat. "Stay close," Jake said, pulling the girl along as they moved toward the crack. He could feel the air growing colder as they approached, and his gut twisted. He didn't know what they were walking into, but it was their only chance. The girl followed without a word, her small hand clutching his tightly. They reached the crack, and Jake's fingers scraped against the stone, searching for an opening. With a grunt of effort, he pushed against it. The stone shifted, and a narrow passageway was revealed. "This way," Jake said, stepping through the opening. The girl followed, hesitating for only a moment before entering the darkness ahead of her. As they moved down the passage, the air seemed to get colder, the walls pressing in tighter. It was hard to breathe, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and earth. Jake's mind raced. What? Had they awakened? What was in that chest? And why did it feel like the entire place was still alive, as if something was watching them? The girl, sensing his unease, looked up at him. "Jake, what is this place? Why is it so cold?" Jake didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight. "But we're getting out of here. I promise." They continued to move, the passage twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the earth. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. They had been walking for what felt like hours, the walls of the tunnel narrowing with every step. Finally, the passage began to open up. A faint light appeared ahead, and Jake felt a surge of hope. He pushed forward, pulling the girl with him, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as they emerged into a larger cavern, their hope quickly turned to dread. The room was vast, much larger than the last chamber, and in the center stood something that made Jake's blood run cold. A massive stone altar, covered in ancient runes, stood in the center of the cavern. The light that filled the room seemed to come from the altar itself, casting long shadows across the floor. Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn back. This place wasn't just a tomb, it was a trap. "What is that?" the girl whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but there was no denying it. The altar seemed to be the source of the power that had been released earlier. And it wasn't finished yet. The girl stepped forward, drawn to the altar as if something inside her was calling her to it. Jake grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "No," he said firmly. "We're not going near that thing." But the girl resisted, her eyes wide and filled with something Jake couldn't place. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice distant. "I have to go." Jake's heart sank as he realized the truth. Whatever was inside her, whatever force had been unleashed by the chest, was still controlling her. The altar was connected to it. And if they didn't stop it now, it would take over completely. "Stay with me," Jake said, his voice full of urgency. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The ground beneath them trembled again, the air growing thick with a cold energy that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. The altar began to glow brighter, the runes on its surface shifting and pulsing. The walls around them began to crack, and the ceiling above them groaned as if it were about to collapse. Jake's heart raced as he tried to pull the girl back, but she was no longer listening. She had already taken a step toward the altar, her eyes locked onto it with an expression of wonder. "No," Jake shouted, his hands gripping her tightly, pulling her away. But the girl struggled, her small body strong with the force of whatever had taken hold of her. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice calm, almost soothing. "It's already inside me." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to pull the girl away from the altar. Her body was stiff with resistance, her small hands gripping the cold stone of the altar as though it had become part of her. The runes on the altar glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the rising energy in the room. The walls of the cavern shook, and the air grew heavy with an overwhelming sense of dread. Jake's grip tightened on her arm, but the girl didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were locked onto the altar, her face a mixture of awe and fear. "No, we can't do this," Jake said through gritted teeth, trying to pull her back. "This thing is controlling you. You have to fight it." But the girl didn't respond. Instead, her eyes glazed over, and her body relaxed, as if giving in to the force that was taking hold of her. Jake's stomach twisted in fear. This wasn't just some ancient curse. It was a living, breathing power that was consuming her. He couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't. With a surge of strength, Jake yanked the girl back, his muscles straining as he pulled her away from the altar. For a moment, he thought he had succeeded. She stumbled back, her feet dragging across the floor as she tried to regain her footing. But then, without warning, the cavern trembled again, the ground beneath them shifting violently. The altar's glow intensified, casting an eerie light across the room. The walls cracked, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy. Jake stumbled, falling to his knees as the force of the energy slammed into him. The girl, now on the ground beside him, let out a low, eerie laugh. It was a sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Her eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, as if the very soul inside her had been replaced by something else, something dark and ancient. "You can't stop it," she whispered, her voice distant and hollow. "It's inside me now. It's too late." Jake's heart raced as he looked into her eyes. The girl he had been protecting, now nothing more than a vessel for whatever dark force had taken hold of her. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't lose her. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jake lunged forward, grabbing the girl by the shoulders and shaking her. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice rough with desperation. "You have to fight this. You're stronger than this thing. You can beat it." The girl's head tilted slightly, as if hearing his words for the first time. For a moment, her eyes flickered with recognition, and Jake thought, just for a moment, that she might break free. But then the energy from the altar surged again, and the girl's eyes glazed over once more. Her hands shot up, pressing against Jake's chest with unnatural strength. "You can't save me," she said, her voice no longer her own. "It's too late." Jake's heart sank as the girl's grip tightened. He knew she was right, but he wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when she was this close to being lost forever. I won't leave you, he growled, his voice filled with a fierce determination. I'll fight with you until the end. With a final surge of strength, Jake slammed his palm into the altar, hoping to disrupt whatever dark magic was at play. But nothing happened. The energy around them continued to grow, the walls of the cavern now glowing with a menacing light. Jake could feel the life being drained from him, the air thick with the weight of the curse that had taken hold of the girl. He needed a way out. He needed to destroy the altar. But how? The answer came to him in a flash. He had to sever the connection between the girl and the altar. The chest was the key. It had to be. Without thinking, Jake released the girl from his grip and bolted for the chest. The glowing runes on its surface pulsed with power, and Jake could feel the heat radiating from it. He could almost hear it calling to him, its dark energy seeping into his skin, into his very bones. But he didn't hesitate. He reached for it, his hands trembling as he gripped the sides of the chest. This ends now, he muttered, pulling the chest toward him. The girl's voice cried out behind him, but Jake couldn't stop. The energy in the room reached a crescendo, and as he lifted the chest into the air, the world around him seemed to shudder. The ground cracked open beneath him, and the air grew even colder, the darkness thickening until he could hardly see. But Jake didn't stop. He threw the chest to the ground with all the force he could muster, smashing it into the stone. The moment it hit, there was a blinding flash of light. Jake shielded his eyes, the force of the explosion knocking him off his feet. The world spun around him, and for a moment, he thought he was lost in darkness. But when he opened his eyes, the cavern had changed. The oppressive energy was gone. The walls were still, and the air was no longer heavy with the force of the curse. He looked around, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The girl was lying on the ground, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She was still alive. Jake staggered to his feet and rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, kid," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You with me?" The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she just stared up at him. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Jake," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. "You saved me." Jake's heart swelled with relief, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax. They had made it. The curse had been broken. But Jake knew deep down that this wasn't the end. Something had been unleashed in that cavern, and whatever it wasn't finished yet. They weren't out of danger. Not by a long shot. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. The cavern had changed. Yes, the oppressive energy had dissipated, and the girl, thankfully, was alive, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. There was still too much unanswered, too much left unexplained. What had really been inside that chest? What force had they awakened? And more importantly, was it truly gone? He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The girl was still lying on the ground, her small body shivering slightly, but looking more alert than before. Jake knelt beside her, brushing her hair from her face as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "Jake," she whispered again, her voice faint but full of gratitude. "We made it out." He nodded, but his face was etched with concern. "Yeah, we made it out. But we're not safe yet." The girl frowned, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? I thought we stopped it." Jake sighed, glancing around the cavern. The chest's power may be gone, but whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. His words hung heavy in the air. The girl struggled to sit up, her hands still trembling, but with a new sense of resolve in her eyes. "You think it's still following us?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Jake didn't have an immediate answer. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was clear. This whole experience had been more than just a one-time curse. It was something far larger, something that had been waiting to be unleashed, and now it had been. The walls of the cavern seemed to echo Jake's thoughts, the silence between them almost unbearable. "I don't know," Jake said quietly, glancing back toward the altar, where the glowing runes had faded into nothingness. "But I can feel it. That energy we unleashed, it's not finished." The girl took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Then what do we do now?" Jake's mind raced, trying to think through their next steps. They had made it out of the cave, but they hadn't left this dark force behind. He needed to think of a plan, a way to stop it for good. We need to find out more, Jake said, standing up and offering the girl his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, allowing him to pull her to her feet. The girl swayed slightly but steadied herself quickly, looking up at Jake with renewed determination. Find out what? How to stop it, she asked. Jake nodded, his expression grim. Exactly. We have no idea what we're really up against. That chest, it wasn't just a random relic. It's part of something bigger, something much darker. They began walking together, the girl's hand still gripping his. The journey they had just survived had shaken them both, but it had also forged a bond that now held them together in their pursuit of answers. They moved cautiously through the cavern, each step echoing in the emptiness around them. As they passed the remains of the altar, Jake's eyes darted to the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the stone floor. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, waiting for something to reawaken. Do you think it's all connected? The girl asked after a long silence, her voice quiet. The altar, the chest, the force inside me. Jake stopped walking, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her. I don't know, he admitted, his mind swirling with confusion. But I do know one thing. Whatever we unleashed, whatever was inside that chest, it's tied to this place, to these markings on the walls. He gestured toward the ancient symbols carved deep into the stone. The girl stared at them, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear. You think these markings have something to do with it? She asked. Jake nodded. I do. These aren't just random symbols. They're part of whatever ritual was done here, whatever was sealed away. The girl took a cautious step forward, her eyes tracing the lines on the walls. How do we stop it? What do we do? Jake looked at the markings too, his mind turning over the possibilities. We need more information, he said slowly. I need to figure out what this place really is, what it was used for. His eyes flicked toward the exit of the cavern, the way out now visible in the dim light. I don't know how long we have before whatever this is finds us again. The girl stepped closer to him, her face more serious than Jake had ever seen it. You said we need to fight it. Do you think we can? Jake's heart tightened at her words. He wasn't sure. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't something you could fight with a punch or a knife. It was far older, far stronger. I don't know, he said, his voice quieter now. But we'll figure it out. Together. They made their way back toward the exit, the tunnel ahead opening into what felt like endless darkness. They could feel it, the weight of whatever had been left behind, waiting for them to make their next move. The air grew thick with anticipation, the silence between them oppressive. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The worst wasn't over. The chest had been destroyed, but something else had been awakened. Something that wouldn't rest until it had finished what it had started. He glanced down at the girl, her small face determined but still filled with uncertainty. We're not out of this yet, Jake said quietly. But we'll figure out a way to stop it. We have to. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. We will, she said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake believed her. Jake's mind raced as he and the girl made their way through the dense forest, the cool night air pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. They had barely spoken since they left the cavern, both of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of what had just happened weighing heavily on their shoulders. Jake glanced at the girl walking beside him. Her face, though still pale from their ordeal, was set in a look of quiet determination. She had proven herself in ways that Jake hadn't expected, but the force that had taken hold of her was far from gone. As they walked, Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. The shadows in the forest seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees only heightened the feeling of unease. It wasn't just the darkness of the forest that unsettled him. It was the sense that something was still watching them, still following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. He tried to push the thought out of his mind. They had to keep moving. They had to get away from the cave, from whatever had been awakened there. How much further? The girl asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but there was a steel edge to it now, a sense of resolve that had not been there before. Jake paused for a moment, trying to get his bearings. He didn't know how far they had traveled, but they couldn't stop until they were out of the woods. Not far, he said, his voice steady. We just need to keep moving. The girl nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She was strong, stronger than most people her age, but even she could feel the weight of what they were running from. It wasn't just the physical danger. It was something deeper, something that had taken hold of her and didn't seem willing to let go. Jake's heart ached for her. She was just a kid, and she had been thrust into something far beyond her understanding. But there was no time to dwell on that now. They had to survive. "Jake," she said after a long pause. "What do you think it was? What's inside me?" The question hung in the air, and Jake found himself struggling to answer. What was inside her? He had seen the change in her when they were in the cavern. The way she had been drawn to the altar, to the chest, like it was calling her. But what was it? A curse? A spirit? Some ancient force that had been waiting to be unleashed? He didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but also with trust. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jake's chest tightened at her words, but he pushed his emotions aside. He couldn't afford to be scared. "Not now." "I know you are," he said, his voice gentle. "But I'm right here. I won't let anything happen to you." They walked in silence for a while longer, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The moon hung high above them, casting long shadows through the trees, but the air was thick with tension, and every snap of a twig made Jake's heart race. They couldn't outrun whatever had been unleashed in the cavern. That much was clear. But what they could do was fight, and Jake was prepared to fight with everything he had. He glanced over at the girl again, noting how exhausted she looked. Her small frame was hunched slightly, and her steps were slower than before. They had been through too much in too short a time. They needed rest, but they couldn't stop. "Not yet." "There," Jake said suddenly, pointing toward a small clearing up ahead. "We can stop there, just for a few minutes." The girl nodded, her shoulders sagging in relief. As they reached the clearing, Jake quickly surveyed their surroundings. The trees around them were thick, offering some cover, but he knew they couldn't afford to stay long. The threat was still out there, and it wasn't going to give up. He dropped to the ground, pulling the girl down beside him. "Stay alert," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what's out there." The girl nodded again, but she was too exhausted to speak. She curled into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees. Jake kept his watchful gaze on the dark forest, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He had to protect her. They both had to make it out of this alive. As they sat there in the silence, Jake's mind kept returning to what they had uncovered. The chest, the altar, the force that had taken hold of the girl. It wasn't just a random encounter. This had been planned. This had been waiting for them. But why? Who was behind this, and what did they want? Jake's eyes narrowed as he thought about the creature they had encountered in the cavern, the one that had nearly taken the girl from him. It had seemed so powerful, so unstoppable. But it was gone now. Was it really gone? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again? "Jake!" The girl's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to her, noticing the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "Do you think it's still following us?" She asked the question quietly, but it hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew the answer. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I do." The girl shuddered, and Jake pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her for comfort. "But we'll make it through," he added, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I won't let it get to you. Not ever." They sat there for a long time, the forest around them dark and still. Jake knew that their journey wasn't over, that it had only just begun. The battle they were about to face would be their hardest yet, but Jake was ready. He would fight with everything he had to protect her, to make sure the darkness they had awakened didn't destroy them. For now, though, all they could do was rest and prepare for whatever came next. Jake and the girl had been walking for hours, the weight of what had happened still pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. They had moved through the dense forest, the tall trees surrounding them, casting long shadows in the late afternoon light. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made Jake's heart race. His instincts screamed that they were being watched. They had barely spoken since they had left the clearing. The girl, her face still pale but determined, walked a few paces ahead of him. Jake could tell she was exhausted. Her small steps were heavy, and the once strong resolve in her eyes had started to fade. She was scared, just as he was. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel the darkness still lingering, like a shadow hanging over them. Whatever they had awakened in that cavern, Whatever had taken hold of the girl, it wasn't gone. Not completely. He had to find a way to stop it before it found them. His thoughts were interrupted when the girl stopped suddenly, turning to face him. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Jake," she said, her voice shaky. "I can hear it. I think it's coming." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was talking about. The feeling of being hunted, of something chasing them, something far older and darker than anything he could comprehend. He scanned the trees, his eyes darting around, but there was nothing. The woods were still, silent. The air seemed thick, almost suffocating. Jake could feel the tension in his chest, the pressure of whatever force was closing in on them. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need to keep moving." But the girl shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, Jake. It's too late. It's already here." Before Jake could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, a primal, bone-chilling growl that sent a shiver down his spine. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and dark, emerging from the shadows of the trees. It moved with unnatural speed, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The creature was back. It had found them. The girl screamed, her voice high and terrified, but Jake didn't have time to comfort her. He grabbed her arm and pulled her behind him, his body instinctively positioning itself between her and the creature. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp. The girl didn't hesitate. She clung to him, her small body trembling with fear. The creature was getting closer, its form becoming more solid, more defined. Jake could see its eyes now, two glowing orbs of pure darkness that seemed to burn into him, piercing his very soul. He could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was reading his every thought, every move. "You cannot escape," the creature hissed, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Jake's heart thundered in his chest. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath, reaching for the knife at his side. But even as his fingers closed around the handle, he knew it wouldn't be enough. This monster, wasn't something you could kill with a knife. The creature took another step forward, its form shifting again, growing taller, more imposing. Jake's body was tense, ready to spring into action, but his mind raced for a solution. He needed to protect the girl. That was all that mattered. The creature's grin widened, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "You cannot win," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more confident. Jake clenched his jaw, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He couldn't defeat this creature with strength alone. He had to outsmart it. Without thinking, Jake yanked the girl away from him, pushing her behind a thick tree trunk. "Run," he shouted. The girl hesitated, fear written all over her face. "But now," Jake roared, his voice filled with urgency. The girl's eyes widened in fear, but she turned and ran, disappearing into the underbrush. Jake turned back to face the creature, his body filled with a new surge of adrenaline. He was ready. Whatever happened, he couldn't let this thing touch her again. The creature seemed momentarily distracted, its attention shifting toward the girl as she fled, but Jake didn't waste a second. He sprinted toward the creature, his knife raised, his eyes locked on its glowing form. The creature hissed, turning back toward him, its dark figure growing larger with every step. Jake's pulse quickened as he reached it, his hand gripping the knife's handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't know if he could kill it, but he had to try. With a roar, Jake lunged forward, aiming for the creature's chest. But his blade passed right through it. It was like trying to stab smoke. The creature laughed, the sound echoing through the trees like a sickening, twisted melody. "You think you can stop me?" it sneered. "I am not so easily destroyed." Jake's heart sank. This wasn't a battle he could win with physical force. He had to figure out what made this thing vulnerable. His eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, that might help. And then he saw it. A faint glow, just beneath the creature's form, coming from a small pendant that hung around its neck. The pendant was glowing with the same dark energy that had surged from the chest. Jake's eyes locked onto it. That was the key. He had to destroy the pendant. Without hesitation, Jake reached for the pendant, grabbing it with both hands and pulling it toward him. The creature shrieked in pain, its form flickering and fading as Jake twisted the pendant in his grip. With a final, resounding snap, the pendant broke, and the creature screamed in agony. The darkness around it began to dissipate, the glowing eyes flickering out. The creature's body twisted and warped, its form collapsing into nothingness. And just like that, it was gone. Jake dropped to his knees, panting, his body shaking with adrenaline. The girl reappeared from behind the tree, her eyes wide with fear. But Jake's gaze was fixed on the ground, the shattered pendant lying in his hand. The darkness was gone, but the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but Jake knew that whatever force had been unleashed was far from finished. And they would have to face it again, sooner or later. Jake sat on the cold ground, his body exhausted but alert, still clutching the shattered pendant in his hand. The remnants of the creature that had haunted them for so long were nothing more than fading shadows now, dissipating with the faint breeze. The girl, standing a few feet away, slowly approached him, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. She was still shaking, but there was something in her eyes now, something that wasn't fear. It was determination. "Jake," she said softly, her voice fragile but steady. "What happens now?" Jake looked up at her, his mind clouded with uncertainty. They had faced down an ancient power, broken the pendant that had tethered the creature to this world, but he knew the truth deep down. Whatever they had dealt with was far from over. The world they had entered, the forces they had awakened, weren't simply gone because they had destroyed one artifact. The girl, she was the key. She had felt it. She had been drawn to the chest, to the altar, to the pendant. And now, even though the creature was gone, the darkness still lingered within her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "But we're not finished yet." The girl stood there in silence, absorbing his words. She glanced down at the shattered pendant in Jake's hand, the dark energy now powerless, and then back up at him. There was a brief moment when their eyes locked, a shared understanding passing between them. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were part of something bigger, something they couldn't undo, no matter how hard they tried. "What do we do next?" the girl asked, her tone steady despite the uncertainty in the air. Jake thought for a long moment, his mind working through the endless possibilities. The chest, the altar, the pendant, it had all been connected to something larger, and he had a feeling that something was still out there, waiting for them. "We go to the source," Jake finally said, his voice low but determined. "We find out who did this, and we end it once and for all." The girl nodded, her hand reaching out to take his. She was ready, even though she was still so young. She had already been through more than most people would ever understand, and yet here she was, standing beside him, ready to face whatever came next. Jake stood up, his knees stiff from the hours of tension and fear, but he forced himself to move. They had come this far. They weren't turning back now. As they walked through the woods, the air still thick with the remnants of dark magic, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his senses on high alert, but there was nothing. No creature. No force lurking in the shadows. Just the quiet rustle of the trees, the sound of the wind as it moved through the forest. But Jake knew better. The world around them was shifting, and they were just beginning to understand the true nature of the forces they had unleashed. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but filled with determination. "Do you think we can stop it? Stop whatever is still out there?" Jake looked down at her, his face set in a hard line. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we have to try." The girl smiled slightly, her grip on his hand tightening. "Then we'll try? Together." They continued walking, the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on them. Jake couldn't help but think about all they had been through. The battles, the fears, the creatures they had fought, and the dark secrets that still lay ahead. But in the girl, he saw a glimmer of hope. She had faced down unimaginable terror, and yet she was still standing. They both were. They had made it this far, and they wouldn't stop until they had found answers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Jake knew their journey was far from over. The creature they had fought wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much larger. And whatever that something was, he wasn't going to let it take the girl from him. Not without a fight. They would find out who was behind this, who had been pulling the strings, and they would make sure that whatever evil they had awakened was destroyed for good. Together, they would face whatever came next. And they would win.